And during the course, we will be having invited speakers who are eminent experts in their respective fields. We will also have sessions where we will have some film screening, some documentary, and of course, we will have interactive sessions with all of you. And I hope this will benefit all of us in the coming 1 month. The Department of Environmental Studies is organizing this under the aegis of the Center for Earth Studies, which is one of the 7 research and learning centers that we have in our college. This center works particularly in the direction of sustainable development, ecological conservation, environmental protection, and related issues. As I said, this is one of the research and learning centers of the college. The college has several centers which tries to gear people within and outside college, the community that we live in, towards research and development in several issues which surround us in our lives. Indraprastha College has a large green campus and it has a huge diversity of flora and fauna, which is also an added advantage and added reason for enthusing us towards thinking in a green way. We also take great pride in stating that Indraprastha College for Women is is the oldest college in the University of Delhi for women, and it has played a very, very seminal role in women's education and empowerment. So I welcome all of you from all over India to Indraprastha College for Women, Center for Earth Studies, Department of Environmental Studies. All these details, the details of the course are there on the web portal. I'm sure all of you have already visited and you also know about us. Please keep a check on the web portal. All the details of the course will be updated regularly, and your course coordinators, Dr. Naveen Kumar Tiwari and Dr. Neha Mishra, will be updating you on a regular basis, session starting from tomorrow after we inaugurate this session today. And in the end, there will be a small evaluation as well for you, which will be the final part of the course. So I welcome you once again to the course on ecology, environment, and sustainability. I now request our principal, Professor Babli Mohitra Saraf, to launch the course, release the course brochure, and finally, following her speech, we will be hearing Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, the keynote speaker of the day. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Anindita Roy Saha. Actually, you have laid out in your opening remarks a wonderful sort of, you flagged the territory, and there is really little that I want to add, I can add here, except to say a couple of things that academically you have given the reasons the reasons for which we have conceptualized this course. But beyond that, also 2 important words which you mentioned in your brochure, which is both flagging policies and as well as methodology. I think both these are extremely important because we know the current controversy in which we find ourselves, responding to the environment document that has been that has caused a lot of heartburn, criticism, and therefore should lead to some kind of assessment. But policy is important because that governs so much of what we can formally do. And the second thing is methodology. I think methodology is the basis of academic inquiry, and that methodology therefore needs to be spelled out. And I'm glad that the course itself is looking at these. What I really want to also add is that taking your point forward, Dr. Roy Saha, that we at Indraprastha College in the Center of Earth Studies, as we recall, Center for Earth Studies conceptualized 4 years ago, has done remarkable work in the field of creating environment consciousness, taking on projects, taking on research which goes beyond the curriculum of the college, and that is the whole point of the college's research and learning centers, how to expand the curriculum into all these, into directions which transcend the prescription that has been received from the competent authorities, or we may say the University of Delhi. Excuse me. I do want to say that for to all of you, actually, those of you who are here on this course, I want to set it up as a kind of paradigm. This methodology whereby we can all treat the environment in which we find ourselves or inhabit in a formal way, that is the educational institution we belong to or we work in, we can actually treat that as a laboratory wherein several kinds of experiments can be conducted, several kinds of studies can be conducted. And under the auspices of the Center for Earth Studies, for instance, we have our colleagues in the environment studies department could take on, for instance, a tree census, could take on birds, a bird count, could also do butterfly corridors. All these things were possible because we just capitalized, unfortunate word, but there we are, capitalized on the environment in which we find ourselves. So it's a green cover, yes, but then it was harnessed to various ecological issues to see how we could create living in this kind of environment, an environment consciousness, which is a vital living engagement with the environment. Our Swachhata, when Swachhata happened, we did segregation of waste also. We did Project Nidan, whereby no waste leaves the campus. And that is why we are able to look at channelizing the various ways in which we can actually organize our societal structures or our institutional structures by just using the campus, our own campus, as a kind of microcosm whereby we can empirically test several of these moves that we can make. So I'm very glad about that. And that is the reason why when we thought in terms of this EBS, this course, we discussed, we discussed the current climate, and as Anindita so eloquently pointed out, the ways in which maybe we have, in a sense, brought this upon us, this current crisis, if you want to sound fateful about it. But regardless, it is fateful because we never think of the consequences of our small acts, and this is such a moment of reckoning for all of us. Having said that, I therefore I think at the last count, I may be corrected, Dr. Tiwari, we had 67 enrolled persons on this course, and that's a great number from all over the country.
Now we have 84 now.
Thank you, Naveen.
84.
So we have 84, which is a great number. And I'm so glad that all of you are logged in at this moment. What we have done, as Anindita also said, but I want to make a point of it, that we have punctuated this course with special lectures. One such lecture is today by Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, and I'll just come to him. We are so fortunate to have him here. He's not been well. He is in the middle of an asthmatic episode, and I entirely leave it to him to organize this lecture and this time as he wishes to, as is comfortable to him. But we are very fortunate, Professor Rangarajan, to have you with us today. But before I hand over the floor to you after a formal introduction, I do wish to take on the task that Anindita has put in my lot, which is the release of the brochure. And I request our student to release the brochure at this point so that we can then go on to, I can go on to formally introducing Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, and we can go on with our this afternoon's lecture. Over to you, Dr. Tiwari, Naveen Tiwari. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm just sharing my screen with the brochure, and
so consider it launched. Yeah, okay, great. Wonderful. So applaud your effort I applaud your effort and also congratulate you and the students who have been involved in this endeavor. And of course, the department and Dr. Roy Saha. I do wish to say that it is because of the efforts of the Environment Studies Department and the Center for Earth Studies that we were recently awarded, last year actually, awarded the course for conducting BSc Honors Environment Sciences in the college. We are not a science college, and we wanted to start that course this time in this academic session, but due to this current crisis, other kinds of organizations which needed to be in place were not there. But be that as it may, it was due to our work in the field of environment and the kind of research that we were doing, research in collaboration also with the University of Delhi, that we were awarded this course. We were found competent in terms of both our infrastructural as well as our human resources to be able to conduct the BSc Honors course in Environment Sciences. I think only 5 or 6 colleges have been awarded this course, but it still needs to take off, and that can take off only next session now. So with the release of the brochure, you will have in your custody or in your hands the information that is required for the course. And now I would like to introduce first Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, and then invite him to start his lecture. So Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, again, I express gratitude to you for your presence here, for joining us today, in spite of your distress. Professor Mahesh Rangarajan is Professor of History and Environmental Studies and Head of the Department of History at Ashoka University. He has been Professor in Modern Indian History at University of Delhi and has also taught at the Universities of Cornell and Jadavpur and at the National Center for Biological Sciences, Bengaluru. He has also served as director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library at New Delhi. He has a BA in History from Hindu College, University of Delhi, and an MA and a DPhil, both from Oxford University. He is a Rhodes Scholar, and he is a prolifically published author. He's written Fencing the Forest, Conservation and Ecological Change in India's Central Provinces, 1860 to 1914, which came out in 1996. India's Wildlife History and Introduction in 2001, and Nature and Nation, Essays on Environmental History, 2015. He edited the books Environmental Issues in India, A Reader in 2007, and the Oxford Anthology of Indian Wildlife, Volumes 1 and 2. He has co-edited several volumes of books, People's Parks and Wildlife Towards Coexistence, Battles Over Nature, Science and Politics of Conservation, Making Conservation Work, Securing Biodiversity in this New Century, Environmental History, As If Nature Existed, India's Environmental History, Volumes 1 and 2, Selected Works of C. Rajagopalachari, Volume 1, Selected Works of C. Rajagopalachari, Volume 2, Nature Without Borders, Shifting Ground, Peoples, Animals and Mobility in India's Environmental History, and At Nature's Edge, The Global Present and Long-Term History in 2018. Now, with this kind of CV, Professor Rangarajan, it would be not out of place to say that you are really, truly the appropriate person, the appropriate academic figure to inaugurate this course with your lecture. And with that, the floor is over to you. Thank you again for being with us in spite of your problems, in spite of your clearly unwellness, but we truly express, IP College expresses its gratitude, and I'm sure this group which is here with us will benefit enormously from what you have to say. Over to you, Professor Rangarajan.
Thank you, Professor Saraf. Thank you, Navinji. Thank you, everyone else. It's a privilege to be here today. I think living in urban India, there are people here from many different parts of India. I think respiratory issues or intestinal problems are not individual personal issues. They are part of the larger environmental challenge. This is a remarkable time. As a student growing up, if you went out for a run at 5 in the morning, everybody complimented you. And now if you want to go out for a run at 5 or 6 in the morning, people say, you really want to go out? Won't you be sick by the time you come back? This was true even before the COVID zoonotic crisis struck. One way to approach this is, of course, to acknowledge that the environment, the issues of ecology, the issues of sustainability require that we rethink the way we approach our disciplines, the way we approach knowledge, the way we approach our relationship to the larger condition, the human condition. And nobody could possibly be adequately qualified for that. That's a vast task. It will take all the forces of everyone in this room to begin to spell out how to think more clearly. But one of the small advantages of being a student of history is that historians are taught to tell stories. And one of the nice things about stories is that stories can make you think. One way to begin this conversation would be to ask why the environment matters to us today. And one answer, of course, is, and it's been said by all the three distinguished people who spoke at the beginning in the inaugural up to now, is that we are at a crossroads. A crossroads is a very interesting place. It's a place where you come to certain decisions, you make certain choices. No matter what decision you make, no matter what choice you take, it will have consequences. Which way you proceed will have implications not only for yourself, but for all those around you. And the way you look at that choice depends a lot, not just on where you are, but how you got there. There's a wonderful episode in a story many of you will be familiar with, Alice in Wonderland, in which Alice is lost on a road, on a path in the forest. And she sees sitting up on a tree a Cheshire cat. And she asks that cat, which way does this path lead to? And the cat says, it all depends on where you want to go. I think there's something very fascinating in that conversation. It just is not about the path and where it leads. It also depends on where we want to go. Some years ago, the British journalist who wrote a marvelous book on China, it had a very odd title. It was on China's environmental crisis, and it was called When a Billion Chinese Jump. So when Jonathan was young, his father told him to pray at night before he went to sleep. And to give him further incentive to pray, he said, just pray that while you're sleeping as a little boy in your bed, all the people in China don't jump. And he asked his father why. His father and mother both said that if you don't pray and they all jump, if a billion people jump, the earth will wobble on its axis. It will wobble so much that you'll fall off your bed and you might get injured. And Watts then argues that now a billion Chinese are jumping. They're not jumping literally, but they're jumping metaphorically. Because the expansion of the number of people in China over the 20th century slowed down from the 1980s on. But much more than that, the huge expansion of the Chinese economy. For about 30 years, China's economy grew at the rate of 8 to 10% per year. These two combined transformations, demographic expansion and economic expansion, more people producing and consuming more goods and services, are having a huge impact on the environment of China, on its mountains, its deserts, its rivers, its forests, its marshes, its seas, its plateaus. Some years ago, the Chinese government announced that a very remarkable creature which lived in the Yangtze River, Yangtze and the Huanghe have been the two rivers which are the cradle of Chinese civilization since centuries. They announced that this Yangtze dolphin was extinct. It's the first freshwater dolphin ever to become extinct on Earth. And one reason for its extinction is not just direct hunting, but the enormous changes which were brought about through new ways of harnessing the Yangtze River, for instance, for power or for fishing. The Indian dilemma is not very different from the Chinese. India has also been through a period of unprecedented economic expansion since independence. There have been different governments. There are different figures of growth rates. There was a period from around 2003 to 11 when the economy grew at 7-8% a year or more. And as you're all aware, the number of people in India now is about twice that which existed in, let's say, the year 1981. So this combined impact of more people and much more than that, the huge implications of the expansion of the economic base has consequences. It has consequences for people. As you know, there's always a debate, more intense now than ever, on how wealth and opportunity are divided across different people, across the lines of gender, across class, across caste, across nation, across race. But this debate, the debate about equality, about the right to live with dignity, the right to have a measure of justice, the right to have a future where your life and the lives of your children or their grandchildren can get better. To this debate, the debate about equality within humanity, equality, as I said, across nations and within nations. To this, I think there are two dimensions which have been added by the environmental debate, particularly over the last 50 years or so. One is the idea across generations. When we think of equality, let's say, all the people in this seminar, or all the people in Indraprastha College, or all the people in Delhi University, or all the people in India, or all the people in Asia or the planet. That's fine. What about those who are as yet unborn? In one sense, the environmental dilemma reminds us that we cannot only think, and we shouldn't only think of equality in terms of the present. We also need to think about equality for the future. We're meeting in August 2020. We're all very conscious about the importance of the environment. And we cannot but forget that it was another August, a very fateful August, the August of 1945, which saw the end of the Second World War. There's a lot of debate among students of history on when the Second World War began. There's very little debate on when it ended. It ended on the 11th of August 1945 when Japan surrendered. But much more than that, for us what is important is not the surrender of Japan on the 11th of August, but two horrific events which took place on the 6th of August 1945 and the 9th of August 1945. These were the dates when the US Air Force dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thousands of people were killed, many more were maimed. There's a book which I recently got for our college library. It's a very difficult book to read. It's simply called Nagasaki, Accounts of Survivors. Until recently, and even now there are a few, survivors of Nagasaki. There are men and women who had horrific injuries, who suffered from radioactive burns and other results of contamination, various forms of cancer, but they survived. And they do something very remarkable. They go to schools, they talk to children, to teachers, to young adults, and tell them about the horror of Nagasaki with a simple message: never again. But Nagasaki and Hiroshima marked the beginning of a new age. They marked the beginning of the atomic age. Until the 1980s, the various countries which acquired the capability to build nuclear weapons continued to build them. It's only as late as 1987 that for the first time, the two major superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union as it then was, agreed not just to limit the number of nuclear weapons, but to decommission some of their weapons. There's something enormously significant about the atomic age. Jonathan Shell, the great writer, said that the danger of a nuclear war would not be that life would cease to exist. Perhaps not all life, but most life. Shell argued that a nuclear war would mean not just the death of life, but something beyond comprehension, the death of death. Because if life were not to exist, how would death exist? So this ability of humans to destroy not just people in the present, but civilizations of the future, humanity as it were. The spread of radioactive contaminants, after all, was not just about nuclear weapons. In the late 1950s, scientists began to find that the radioactive waste, the radioactive substances that were released by nuclear tests in the atmosphere and the ocean spread through the prevailing winds, with the waters, by entering into the plant matter, in animal tissue, And they found that substances like strontium-90 and caesium-37 were present in the blood and tissue of every child, woman, and man on Earth. This led by 1963 to the partial nuclear test ban treaty, and the countries of the world began to agree step by step, not all at one time, not to conduct these tests in the atmosphere or in the ocean. By then, in 1962, there's a very important scholar who I think, particularly because we're in a women's college, one ought to mention, not just by name, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson worked in Woods Hole in a very important marine lab. Woods Hole has done some of the very important work in our own day about the possibilities of global warming, about greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide. But in her day, it was a marine lab par excellence. Marine biologist that she was, Rachel Carson, had been unable to complete a doctorate because in the 1940s and 50s, it was not regarded as something women ought to do. There are still very few women scientists. There were even fewer in the days when Rachel Carson was growing up. She therefore opted not to do a doctorate. She could do one, but she stopped studying after her master's. She became a popular writer. And in 1962, she published the most remarkable book. It was called Silent Spring. I heard it said right at the beginning by Professor Saraf that the Indraprastha College for Women is not a sciences college. Well, Rachel Carson was a scientist, but she was also a figure of the arts and of literature. To this day, her book, Silent Spring, remains a bestseller. It's a book that uses the methods of science. It brings us very close to something which was not a widely known science at the time, the science of ecology, the study of the structure and the function of nature. But it does so in language that is almost poetic. Rachel Carson bridged the worlds of science and the humanities. She didn't just describe the world or explain how it works. She was an advocate for a new way of seeing nature, not in terms of bits, but in terms of a whole. Her first chapter was a famous one. She said there was once a town in the heart of America where the voices of spring had been silenced. And she talked about, in a very famous story and rendering, about the robin whose song heralded the coming of spring. And the robins, she said, had died because the eggs which they laid could not hatch fledglings. And the fledglings died because the DNA in the mother robin's body did not give the right signals. The DNA did not give the right signals because of chemical contamination in the bodies of earthworms, which had been eaten by the robin. And the earthworms had eaten leaves that had fallen off from the trees. And the trees and the plants and the shrubs and the herbs and the bushes had been sprayed with new varieties of chemical pesticides. These were pesticides such as DDT, dieldrin and aldrin, which came into widespread use during the Second World War. They were used in powder form because millions of men were moving all around the world, and you didn't want these armies of men falling ill due to ticks and lice, falling ill due to various diseases. But when these very powders were mixed into oil and sprayed, they had an incredible effect. They killed off the insects, which was such a problem for farmers, for horticulturists, for people who wanted to grow flowers and fruits and grain and other sorts of crops. But the impact of these pesticides was felt long after they had been sprayed. Carson famously pointed out that the very idea that you could solve a complex problem, the presence of insects in a garden, a field, a forest, a meadow, a flower patch, with a linear solution, get the pesticide, spray it, and kill the insect, that this did not acknowledge that the cycles of life were not linear but circular, that nature could not be understood by breaking up into discrete bits. It was best understood when you looked at it as a whole. The chapters of Carson's book are remarkable. There's one called Earth's Green Mantle. There's one called The Waters of Life. And there's one called Beyond the Dreams of the Borgias. The Borgias were these very evil popes of Rome who killed and murdered because they wanted to become extremely powerful. And Carson then, towards the end of her book, quoted a famous poem by Robert Frost, where she said that we have come now to the path in the wood where the road diverges. And the two paths, the two roads are very different. And she argued we ought to go by the road not taken. She did not argue for a ban on pesticides. She did not argue that nothing should be done about insect pests because they could be a threat to human life. Think of the malarial mosquito. Think of the cotton ball weevil. Think of the brown leaf hopper, which for many years afflicted rice growers in much of southern India. But she argued for biological methods of control, for understanding the ways of nature and drawing on them. And she very strongly protested the term the conquest of nature. She even branded entomology, the study of insects, a Stone Age science, because it was about the elimination and eradication of insects when we ought to be talking of their control. By the end of the 1960s, there was a transformation across the earth. You all are perhaps aware that there have been many wars since the Second World War. One of the very important wars was in an Asian country, Vietnam, and the United States was engaged in that war for 10 long years, from 1965 to 75. In the late 1960s, as American troops were fighting guerrillas in the jungle, they found it was difficult to see them. It was difficult to spot them. It was difficult to cut off their supply lines. So rather than just bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, as it was called, they hit upon another new idea. US Air Force, along with large chemical companies, deployed pesticides, not insect killers, but plant killers. They're known as herbicides. And they sprayed over 15% of the land area of Vietnam with herbicides. One of them had a colorful name and a deadly history. It was called Agent Orange. Many years later, in fact, in the decade of the 2000s, many of the pilots who had sprayed Agent Orange over Vietnam went to court, established that Agent Orange had damaged their health, sometimes permanently. It had damaged their nervous system, their livers, their lungs, their animal tissue in their bodies, and they won a settlement. There was no such settlement for the Vietnamese who were affected by Agent Orange. Because here we see warfare taken to another level. Here it is not about radioactive waste, which directly maims and kills people or makes them much more vulnerable to a variety of cancers. These chemical pesticides entered into the ecological system. They modified the structure and function of nature, often in irreparable ways. They didn't just kill the plants on which they were sprayed. They lodged themselves into the soil, the waters, the plant tissue, the animal tissue. There are people today, now, who are adversely affected by those pesticides that were sprayed in Vietnam. Now, in 1972, the various nations of the earth came together and they held a UN conference on the human environment. Since 1972, there have been several conferences on the human environment held by the United Nations. But 1972 was special because it was the first such conference. Now, the people who went to the first conference were really fortunate and lucky because nobody could go to a first conference after that. But many of them took note of the fact that while the first conference on the human environment was held in the Swedish city of Stockholm, a remarkable city which escaped the bombings of the Second World War, which escaped the warfare of the First World War. Sweden is a country which has been at peace since the 18th century. It's had over 300 years of peace. There are very few such countries around. Sweden and its fellow Scandinavian countries had already by the 1970s demonstrated a very deep concern about the human environment, not just about nature and wildlife and trees and plants, but also about safety in working places and living spaces. And the Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme, was one of only 2 prime ministers who was present at Stockholm. Interestingly, the other prime minister was a woman. It was quite remarkable in 1972 to have a woman prime minister. There were only 3. Believe it or not, all were in Asia. Srimarvo Bandaranaike of Ceylon, Golda Meir of Israel, and I'm sure you guessed it, Indira Gandhi of India. Now, at the UN conference on the human environment, there was a sharp divide between 2 sets of countries, the developed countries and the developing countries. Most of the developed countries, not all, were former colonial powers. They included the various nation states of Western Europe. They included Japan. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Sure,
Divide, but now
Yeah, the sound is okay. I'll just carry on.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So in 1972, the developed countries had a somewhat different perspective from the developing. The developed countries, hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, my picture has gone off. It will probably come on. Okay, just one sec.
We can see you also.
One second. Let me just. So the developed countries argued, led by the United States, Western Europe, that the problem of the environment was principally one of population. The Earth, simply put, had too many people. Perhaps they had a point. If you look at the Earth between 1900 and 2000, there were 4 times as many people on Earth by the year 2000 as there were in the year 1900. Needless to say, the largest numbers of people lived in the developing countries, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. So the developed countries, or rather many of their leaders and their conservation organizations, argued too little space, too many people. If the developing countries did not control their population, this was it. The crisis would continue. The counter to this came from many developing countries. The Chinese in particular. China was a very important country, and the Chinese leadership argued, very famous formulation, they said that of all things, people are the most precious. And they argued, and several other countries supported them in this, that the problem was not one of people, it was on inequality. The wealth of the world was unevenly distributed. The United States, with at that time 6% of the world's population, accounted for 25 to 30% of its resource consumption. The figure is not very different now. The US probably accounts for 4% of the world's population and would account, depending on the resource, for 25, 30, or 40% of its consumption. So there was this big divide between the rich and the poor. Was it a problem of too many people? Or was it a problem of unequal distribution? The leader of one prominent African country said that he was not against pollution because in his country, the coming of industry meant development. Indira Gandhi was a very interesting figure in this debate because she took a middle line. She argued that the environment had to be saved. The environment required protection. The environment required protection because it was a common good for everybody. But she also argued that the greatest polluter was poverty. This is a oft-quoted phrase, often held against her. But we have to look at her not as a party political leader or even as Indian Prime Minister, but someone who is articulating a larger sentiment. And if you look at that entire paragraph, she said, do we not know that poverty is the greatest polluter? How can we try to save a forest when there are people living at its edges who depend on the forest for a living? How can animals be secure if the people are not? We are told, she said, to lift ourselves out of poverty by our own bootstraps. But how can you think of bootstraps when you have no boots at all? And she then argued that modern technology and science ought to be available for the poor countries, and particularly for those who are not well off in the poor countries, because only then would they have access to the fruits of development: clean water, sanitation, housing, food, a decent income. And to get to all of these basic prerequisites for a life of material dignity, to get these without harming the environment, unquote. In a sense, over the last 50 years, this dilemma has not just remained, but grown manifold. The Earth is finite. It is finite in terms of its space. 3 years before the Stockholm Conference, something remarkable happened. I'm sure you all guessed what. In July 1969, a man walked on the moon. And one of the remarkable events of the Apollo missions of the United States were that they resulted in one of the most famous photographs of the Earth ever taken. And it shows a small planet of blue and green, bristling and humming with life against the darkness of outer space. This then led to a very popular phrase, which is still used, planet Earth. Another phrase still used, spaceship Earth. The idea that you had only one planet, that whatever the differences of caste and creed, of ideology, and belief and faith, there was no go except to make this planet work. But by the early 1970s, the idea of making the planet work was not just about living in peace. It was not just about peace among people. It also came to be about how to move towards a peace with nature. One of the very interesting figures whom Mrs. Gandhi did not meet in 1972 and her subsequent trips to the United States was also an American. Unlike Rachel Carson, he was not a woman, he was a man. He was a Jew. He was the son of Russian Jews who had emigrated to the United States. He studied in New York, and he became a professor of ecology. He was already famous by 1970. In one day, believe it or not, he flew in a plane to many places and took some trains. He gave a lecture in not one, not two, but 22 colleges and universities, Earth Day 1970. He made it to the cover of Time magazine, and he was known as Dr. Ecology. Bhari Kamana argued that you couldn't understand the crisis of ecology unless you came to terms with the fact that much of modern technology was built on linear principles. Very remarkable argument to Rachel Carson's. And it did not take account of a holistic view of nature. Much more than Carson, Kamana, in his book, The Closing Circle, tried to uncover the underlying principles of a functioning ecology for the 20th and the 21st centuries. Kamana argued that ecology could be reduced to 3 or 4 simple laws. The first was a very simple one. It said all things are interconnected. It's a very important point. All things are interconnected. The instance he gave would be one all of us would be familiar with, the internal combustion engine. The coming of the internal combustion engine, its use for motor transport in the 1920s by Henry Ford, led to a great transformation in transport. It was possible to use diesel and petrol, other kinds of hydrocarbons for mass transit. Individual car ownership first grew in the United States, then in Western Europe. For the last 50 years, it has grown in China, in India, in East Asia, large parts of Latin America and Africa. Kamana's point was simple. The internal combustion engine aimed to get mileage per liter of petrol or diesel. But the very way the internal combustion engine was designed would generate nitric and carbon oxides, which were dangerous not just to human health, but which did not have a counterpart in nature. So unlike, say, carbon dioxide, which could be recycled because of plants, which generate oxygen in the day and carbon dioxide only at night, green plants. This was not the case with the various pollutants that came from the internal combustion engine. Now, Kamana was not arguing you ought to ban the internal combustion engine. He was doing something very crucial to us. He was urging us to think about why this technology was a failure. And his argument, it was not designed to meet these ends. It was succeeding at what it was designed for, because it had failed to take account of a basic law of ecology. All things are interconnected. This increase of atmospheric pollution would have huge consequences for human and animal health. Related to this was the second law, and you'll see the relationship immediately. It simply said, everything goes somewhere, or there's no such thing as waste. A good instance would be the huge amount of human excreta, which is dumped into rivers and lakes. In the 1970s and 80s, many environmental movements were significant in various parts of India. In 1982, Anil Agarwal, product of the IITs, led a group in the Center for Science and Environment. They put together the first State of Environment report, and they quoted government reports which said 70% of all the surface water in India was contaminated. Much of it was contaminated with sewage. And the reason for this, and if you look at Kamana, is if you dump such large amounts of sewage into the waters, the capacities of renewal and repair which would be there for these wastes simply broke down. So the second law, everything goes somewhere, or expressed differently, there's no such thing as waste. The third was a very interesting law. Kamana argued nature knows best. This again became evident, particularly in India in the early 1970s. As you know, in 65 and 66, there were 2 years of rainfall failure. The India of the late 1960s was very different from the India of today. The India of the late 1960s, 75% of the people were dependent on agriculture. Much larger percentage of people lived in the villages. Food production was still low. The country depended in years of scarcity of food imports from abroad. And in those 2 years, 65 and 66, 20 million tons of grain had to be imported from the United States, grain for which India simply did not have the foreign exchange. It became a debtor to the United States for this grain. And it was in these circumstances, due to policies already initiated in the early 60s, that India launched the Green Revolution, a remarkable success through application of nitrogenous fertilizers, high-yielding varieties, heavy availability of water, particularly from tube wells. It became possible to have very high yields, particularly of wheat, later of rice. You may be aware that a few years ago, we had a shortfall of rain in 2015. We've had droughts earlier, for instance, in 87 and 88, in 1972 and 73. But in these years, this kind of food shortage had become a part of the past, thanks to the Green Revolution. But one of the unintended side effects of the Green Revolution is that the nitrogenous fertilizers, particularly urea, which helped to raise the yields, was not all absorbed by the plant. Much of it leached into the groundwater. Some went away into the rain, into rivers, lakes, ponds, and the sea. So across the world, and after all, the use of chemical fertilizers is not unique to India. It's a global phenomenon. These nitrogenous fertilizers have resulted in a vast expansion of food yields, of the yields not just of grain, but of other plants such as cotton or tobacco. But the nitrogen, which has gone into these water bodies, has resulted in huge algal blooms, which have made these waters bereft of oxygen. In other words, to go back to commoner, nature knows best. These nitrogenous fertilizers were very good for boosting plant yields in a short span of time. But they were not substances that were amenable to break down in the way other kinds of natural substances and chemical compounds are, either in the soil or in the water. They were non-degradable. And because they were non-degradable, they had major after effects, not only for the small little farms or the large homesteads on which they were used, but for the ecological system of the planet as a whole. I want to go to another aphorism of Barry Commoner's. He argued there's no such thing as a free lunch. You could illustrate this again in the late 60s and early 70s. This was a time when there was a big debate about the course of development which the world had embarked upon from the mid-1940s. The period after 1945 led to an end of global wars. There has been, thankfully, no Third World War. There were a lot of small wars. But this period from 45 to 73 was a period of unprecedented economic growth. The gross world product enormously increased. These new technologies, such as automation, chemical fertilizers, the internal combustion engine, hydroelectric power plants, thermal power plants became available to more and more countries. But by the late 60s and early 70s, along with the debates on inequality of gender, class, nation, the environmental issue had begun to be very important, not only in developed countries, I refer to Commoner and to Carson, but also in developing countries. In the Indian case, I think by the early 70s, it became clear that there was a very distinctive kind of environmental concern, which was even more widespread in developing countries than the developed. These concerns were there in the developed countries as well. I was just listening last night to the speech of Michelle Obama in the Democratic Convention, and one of the issues she raised was of race, Black Lives Matter, and the right to live with dignity for people of color. What she did not mention, she couldn't, she was speaking at a political convention, is that in the late 60s, in the civil rights movement in the US, it was not only the issue of common access to washrooms or to schools or to buses or to roads that came up prominently. One of the very important issues raised was that chemical waste dumps were often in the areas close to where people of color lived, or that the areas where they lived tended not only to be poor, but to be much more subject, for instance, to air and water pollution and contamination. So this unequal spread of environmental bads, of the malign impacts of technology, became very significant in the developed, but much more so in the developing world. In southern India, in parts of Karnataka, there were laborers who worked on fields, and they were paid for not just in cash, but in rice. And even very poor laborers are not entirely capable, should they be, of eating rice on its own. So they added salt, they added some ginger, or if they put some chili, and they caught hold of fish or crabs which were available in the rice paddies. Over time, it was found that they began to have deformed children, and doctors who studied this called this the Haddi-Guddu syndrome because of the chemical contaminants which had been sprayed in the fields, which found their way into the bodies of the crabs and the fish and the various amphibians which lived in these paddy fields, which were then consumed by these laborers. There were other much more well-known instances, one of them very significant. I'll just mention the name, the Chipko Andolan, a very important movement of hill women and peasants to safeguard the trees, particularly the broadleaf forests of the Himalayas, where they raised the question of who these trees were for. Were these trees only for resin, for wood, for timber, for generating revenue, or were they not important, not just for the livelihood of these villages, particularly of the women and the poor, but for the entire ecological system of the Himalayas? So I think in this 50-year period, the level of awareness of these issues has undoubtedly risen. Today, when we think of summits on the environment, there have been summits in Copenhagen, Johannesburg, Rio, most recently Paris. It's not one or two. There are very few heads of state or government who do not turn up there. But are we therefore any closer to understanding what to do? And the answer, of course, is yes and no. As a student of history, I would slightly differ from the idea that we can generate solutions. My sense is that it is not our job to generate solutions. My sense is it's our larger task to learn how to think. Because what may seem a solution for one person may mean the birth of a problem for another. Think of, for instance, one of the ways in which many developed countries tackled the issues of chemical pollution, which were highlighted so well by Rachel Carson. They banned the use of DDT, dieldrin, and aldrin. Very few people amongst you would have seen a peregrine falcon, but you would have heard of two people I will name, Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie. They are Oscar-winning actors. And they acted in a very interesting and very scary film. Don't see it late at night. It's called The Bone Collector. It's about, two cops and how they find the bad man who's carrying out these murders, who collects the bones of victims. In the beginning of the film, it's a very lovely scene. Denzel Washington is lying on a bed. He doesn't get up from the bed the whole film because he's paralyzed. But, his brain is functioning and he keeps directing people how to do detective work. They look out of the window and they see this beautiful peregrine falcon which takes off and flies off. Now, by the time the peregrine falcon came in the film, The Bone Collector, it was taken off the endangered species list. But DDT, which is not used in the United States, is used very extensively, including, by the way, in India. So there's the question of double standards. Are there certain risks which the developed world will not allow in its own territories, but exports to the developing world? And in the developing world, will you come across a very familiar argument? Oh, the environment is very nice and very important, but you know what? We're going to develop first and we'll take care of the environment later. It sounds very beguiling. The problem is it isn't so simple. And to go back to what Barry Commoner argued, the fact that there are interconnections in nature, that everything goes somewhere, that nature knows best, means that in those countries, such as India, which have a large number of disadvantaged people, of the poor, issues of the environment will affect them even more than the rich. Think of the last 10 to 15 years. The enormous floods that have devastated Mumbai or Chennai because during the times of the rains, the waterways through which the excess water flowed away have been built up. The people exposed most to the floods are the homeless and the poor. Think of the huge impact of air pollution. There are all sorts of figures about the loss to the GDP, the number of people who lose their lives prematurely due to air pollution. A very large number of them are those who cannot afford healthcare and who anyway were perhaps malnourished or too poor to take any action when they found that their lung capacity was being hampered. But there's something else about the environment which is very fascinating. That the environment is not just an issue of the poor. It's one of those issues where people of different classes and groups can come together. This coming together, of course, may not be easy. We saw the divide between the rich and the poor. There were times it was bridged. The partial nuclear test ban treaty of 1963 was one. They were able to agree that nuclear tests in the atmosphere or the ocean, no matter who carries them out, no matter why they are done, are harmful to all. This was similarly the case with chlorofluorocarbons. Next time you open your fridge, it doesn't have chlorofluorocarbons because in 1987, there was a treaty between the countries of the world. The rich shared some of the technology, provided some of the capital, and chlorofluorocarbons were phased out. Has huge implications for climate change because chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons, I use the short form, CFC, HFC, are 24 times more serious in terms of global warming than carbon dioxide. But these kinds of sharing come very rarely. It's been so much more difficult to get an argument going on climate change because of such sharp divergences of approach between the rich and poor countries. There are similar divergences within countries. So for instance, and I'll end with this, 10 years ago, I worked with several elephant experts. There was a elephant task force set up by the government of India. When we think of the environment, after all, we are not only thinking of humans, we're thinking of the larger tapestry of life of which we are a part. India is a country of not just a billion plus people. It's also a country of, believe it or not, over 500 mammals, 1,000 varieties of fish, over 1,000 species of reptiles, 1,000 species of birds. When you walk in Indraprastha College in the monsoon, you'll see dragonflies flying around, and some of them could have come from as far away as Kenya. If you take a walk in the monsoon, you will hear the cry of the pied-breast cuckoo, and the chances are that it's flown in from East Africa. If you walk the grounds in winter, you'll see pied wagtails and oriental wagtails, and many of these wagtails go off in the summer, believe it or not, to Siberia. So there is a way in which the tapestry of life, all of these living things are interconnected. And the fact that they are able to exist, to survive, to breed, to thrive is a measure of the fact that the environment is healthy. They're not just important in terms of dollars and cents. There's a lot of debate and a lot of studies to show that the tiger reserves of India are important because they help to renew the water source cycle, that there are a lot of pharmaceutical drugs that can be made from the wide range of flowering plants and herbs that are found in these reserves and forests. All that is true. But much more than that, this tapestry of life, the fact that it holds together, is important even to our own survival and to our own sense of value and dignity. Now, when we were conducting the Elephant Task Force report, we held hearings in various parts of the country, and we were horrified to find two things. One, that though elephants are deeply respected, revered, even worshipped in many parts of India, and the elephants in 20 states of India, there are 25 to 28,000 of them, which is a lot of elephants, more than any other country in Asia. Over 400 people are killed every year by elephants, and over 100 elephants every year are killed by people. I just want to use this instance to illustrate something. None of the people has been killed by elephants because they want to eat them. Elephants, as you know, are vegetarian. Most were killed in fields. So they were farmers, or shareholders, or laborers defending their crops. The elephants entered the crop field because they wanted to feed. Now, it's not that the elephants were coming out of the forest into the field, which you often read about in the papers. In fact, the home range of the elephants included large areas of human habitation. Elephants don't stay in one place, they move because they're very large beasts and they consume huge amounts of green fodder, 100, 120, even 200 kg of fodder a day if you're an adult elephant. And the number of people affected by elephants at that time was over 500,000. Huge amounts of threat to human life, to their homes, to their fields. The converse, 60-70% of the elephants which were killed by farmers and laborers. They were not killed for ivory, they were simply killed in self-defense. So our task force argued that the elephants which were killed by people and the people who were killed by elephants were both victims. What we needed was to ensure dignity, survival, and life for both. So first choice, to say it's either the farmer and laborer or the elephant. We wanted an India which had both the farm laborer and the farmer and the elephant. And the answer to this was not just to secure the protected areas where elephants live. We have a number of such areas, as I said, very substantial areas, good populations, good numbers, often with reasonably good protection. We also needed to secure the lives of elephants beyond these protected areas. To do so, compensation for farmers ought to be immediate. Redress for loss of life ought to be immediate. There can't be any redress for loss of life, but to the extent there can be, monetarily it ought to be there. And there ought to be ways worked out to minimize the havoc that is caused to cultivation by elephants. And there also ought to be measures to ensure that there be adequate protection and spaces where elephants can move so that they do not come into conflict with cultivation. Sad to say, other than make the elephant a national heritage animal 10 years on, very little of that report has seen the light of day. Let me conclude by making 3 points. There is a crisis of the environment, and we ought to all begin where we are. We're privileged that this workshop has been hosted by Inaugural College, which has a fine reputation, won through hard work, careful planning, dedication of whole host of students and teachers and members of the community to make not just the campus green, but to make the awareness of the environment part of the larger process of education. But this journey is a long journey. You must begin where you are, but it can't end where we are. It must begin for us today in Indraprastha College, but it can't end there. Because however many steps we travel, it won't be enough. This is an issue which requires that we learn to think afresh and anew. To go back to Kamana, to think in a holistic way, to think in a way that connects the part to the whole, to not look at one of the strands in the spider's web, or just look at the spider, but look at the web as a whole, and to look at the web, not just the web worn by the spider, but the larger web of life itself. This sense of being part of a tapestry of a living landscape is something which is a deep insight that the environmental movement has provided us. And it is something that disciplines, all the disciplines, the arts, the sciences, the humanities, the performing arts, would do well to deeply imbibe as a sensibility and sensitivity. And more important than these are issues which will, of course, challenge us as citizens. We will have different views and different ideas on what should be done and by whom. But each of us, because we are in a university, can contribute something in how to think about this, drawing on our own disciplinary training. So, to end on the same note which Watt said, he said you should be scared when 1 billion Chinese jump. I don't think 1 billion Chinese are going to jump. I don't think we can say our prayers, but I don't think we should be scared of falling off our beds or the sky falling down on our heads. But we must be aware that the issues of the environment are an issue for excitement, for adventure, for new ways of thinking. And after all, if you begin with new ways of thinking, there's no limit on where you can go. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rangarajan, for this really enlightening and interesting talk, which has sort of set up the base of the pyramid for this course. And we assure you that we will try our level best to build the pyramids to the tip with all its perfection. So, Professor, you so beautifully placed some landmark events in the history of environmental discourse, like Silent Spring, World War II, Agent Orange, Wildlife Protection Act 1972, and some of the contemporary environmental issues as well, like population explosion, loss of species, excessive use of agrochemicals. We really appreciate that some of these complex and sometimes intermingle areas were so easily clarified to all of us. So I think I would open the house for any question and answer sessions, and the participants can also ask questions. So you can switch on your camera and microphone if you wish to ask any question, and you can discuss directly with Professor Rangarajan. So questions, if any.
Hello. Good morning, Professor. Good evening, Professor.
Please go ahead, Rizwa.
It was a wonderful keynote. Thank you so much. Sir, in the beginning of the lecture, you mentioned that, how Nagasaki and it all affected, which is very much true. We are still facing the side effects of radioactivity and nuclear wastes. But, sir, we recently, the news have come up that US have started their nuclear production again. After 70 years, their factories are open, and not just USA. Seeing this, China has also opened, Russia has also opened, and I'm pretty sure India and other countries would also be opening these things very soon. So what would you like to comment about it? And what all, see, I think at this moment, the country, especially the political powers, would not agree to disband all the nuclear arms. But what safety measures could we take to minimize this? Could you please comment on that? Thank you.
Yes, the present US administration has scrapped the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, and the treaties of US and Russia, they are also planning to set them aside. And it is true, from late 1980s to now, there was a cap on the arms race of the two major superpowers. They still have roughly the same number of nuclear weapons. There are two answers to your question. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a great fear of nuclear war in Europe. There was a great campaign for nuclear disarmament. And one of the things they did is they pulled out a very nice pamphlet brought out by the British government called Protect and Survive. It said if there is a nuclear war, hide under your bed. Cover your head with a brown paper bag. And more sophisticated versions said that you should go and hide in a bunker or a cellar with lots of food. The answer is none of these will work. Not that you shouldn't do them. The best way to avoid a nuclear war is to prevent one. And the best way to minimize the impact of nuclear radioactive waste is to not produce any. And certainly, it should be said that there is an astonishing number of people, including very senior people, who has absolutely no idea what a nuclear war is. They have no conception. The idea of fission, of fusion, of radioactive waste, the notion that there is half-life, what half-life means. So, if you have X amount of plutonium, if it says half-life of 900 years, it means in 900 years, half that 1 kilo will cease to be radioactive. Then we'll take another 900 years for the next half, and then another 900 years. So these, I'm sure you'll agree that these conceptions of time are very large. Even a very trained human mind may not grasp it. So one simple answer is that I think people ought to increase the awareness of the enormous catastrophic risk of nuclear radiation and radioactive waste. And in the 1980s, if there were agreements, in the 1960s, there were agreements. They were also because there were these large movements and there were efforts to try to bring this awareness to the highest levels. The Indian Prime Minister then was Jawaharlal Nehru in 63. And one of his opponents was Rajaji, very big opponent. And he asked him to lead an all-party delegation to the White House. And they went to the White House. And they met the President of the United States, Jack Kennedy, very handsome young man, but very tall. So when Rajaji met him, he had to look up. And he said, am I looking at the President? Am I looking at the President of the United States? And Kennedy said, you are indeed, sir. And they sat. And about some months later, Kennedy was persuaded by these views. And Kennedy and the leader of the Soviet Union, then Khrushchev, agreed to sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So I think that there can and will be change, but we need to work much more to bring an awareness of this about. And it will be an uphill task, and it won't be a one-time task. It may have to be renewed over and over again. And it's a worthwhile cause. I mean, we are looking at the future of life on the planet and human civilization. There isn't a bigger cause to bat for in a sense. Sanchita, you have asked a very good question. In order to ensure environmental conservation, what do you think can be said about the trade-off between climate financing and conservation post-COVID-19? Very difficult question to answer. COVID-19 is barely 6 months old. Its outbreak began in December 2019. We are in August 2020. I'd like to give this some more time. Let me just, however, make two observations. COVID-19 as a zoonotic is only one such case where a particular virus or bacterium has made the jump from a non-human species to a human species. In this part of the world, in India, in South Asia, we are all aware of the huge impact in 1897 and after of the bubonic plague, which was communicated through rats. Rats harbored the parasite which spread bubonic plague. And at the end of the Great War, or the First World War, after 1918, there was the incorrectly named Spanish influenza. It didn't come from Spain, but they called it Spain. Actually came from Kentucky in the US. These two episodes, bubonic plague and Spanish flu, accounted for the life of over 18 million people in British India. 18 million people, population about 300 million. Now, we are fortunate that COVID-19 so far has not had that kind of fatality. But one of the important takeaways from COVID-19 is to realize that we are part of a larger tapestry of life, and much more respect for the other life forms is definitely called for. So it's been pointed out that denudation and destruction of tropical forests, which harbor species such as bats, may increase the risk of human exposure to these diseases. So I don't know what the direct links of climate financing and conservation. I think it's too early to say. Let's say that COVID-19 and its aftermath will require us to rethink many of these questions. My sense, and I would submit, is that the purpose of education is not to be told answers. It's to learn how to think about questions. Each of us will come up with different answers, and the contention between those answers and questions is the stuff of education. There's another question by Prof, which says, the recent EIA 20, some interesting things are happening today. Would you like to comment on it? Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question on Environment Impact Assessment Draft Notification 2020? Or would you like to amplify your question? You want me to comment on it? Shall I go ahead?
Yes. I think yes, sir.
Okay. Well, my view is simple. I think that there is a certain growth fundamentalism among leaderships in many countries. The President of the United States exemplifies it best, but it is there in several countries, including our own. And the idea that environmental regulation is a barrier to growth may have some validity. It's possible that the way the regulations are worked out, the enormous delays, the multiple committees is not the most desirable way to go about it. But I was watching a fascinating program in which a very leading journalist, Nitin Sethi, pointed out that under the previous governments, in India we're a democracy, we have different governments. The previous government in 10 years, 97% of the environmental clearances given under the EIA were going through, and now the figure has gone from 97 to 98%. So it doesn't seem all that different. What is similar is this growth fundamentalism. And I think very few people would argue that the way the environmental assessments are done is adequate or holistic. But the notification seems to make it even less adequate and even less holistic. But government has said they are looking into the criticisms, and one should be hopeful that they will pay attention to them. But this idea of having a longer view, I think, is the critical question. The longer view. The question of not just what happens in the immediate 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years. And a more holistic of looking at the environment in terms of an interconnected whole. And many of the assessments simply are not up to it. And this notification may make things worse. Yeah, can we have some more responses?
So there is a question from Chandni Thapa, sir. I'll just read it out to you.
Sure.
Thank you for such an insightful address, sir. You emphasized on beginning where we are. Could you please point some way forward for addressing inequality towards sustainable development? Thank you.
Well, one answer obviously is to raise the question of who bears the costs and how can the costs be more even. So one of the issues which I'm sure you'll all agree is that in many of the cities, my distinguished colleague Amitabh Bhaviskar has just done a fantastic book. It's called Uncivil City, largely looks at Delhi. And she shows that in Delhi, over the last 20 years, large numbers of poor people have been moved out, for instance, along the Yamuna riverbanks in order to clean up the river. But the quantum of pollution in the river due to industry continues to go up. So I think this unevenness of the cost is something we really need to address extremely seriously. There are other costs which are hidden. I'm sure that all of you are aware that half the cooking energy in India comes from biomass. It doesn't come from gas. It comes from plants, leaves, wood, cow dung. And much of this is gathered by women. And the amount of labor time that is taken, the enormous personal effort that it involves, the calories of energy that are expended. That situation has changed substantially in the last 50 years, but there's a lot of things which remain as they were. So my sense is these inequalities are there around us. We can identify whether it's the space of the city we live in, whether how cooking energy is provided for, and we try to tackle it where it is. But raise the larger questions as a larger society, how we address these issues. So a more even system of development would provide a material dignity for these people with a sense of rights, while protecting and improving the state and quality of the environment. Both have to be done together. Now, everybody will say this. If you say this, nobody will disagree. When you get down to the hard facts, it will get complicated. So if you say, I want to plant trees, they'll say, oh, how nice. If you say we should save trees, it will be very good. Say, don't fell these 10 trees, they say, oh, here comes a troublemaker. So I think that one needs both constructive ways forward, but we also need peaceful, non-violent, engaged forms of critique. We need engaged forms even of protest, engaged forms, non-violent, law-abiding, nothing breaking those rules. Without that, the kind of transformation we want may not come about. But that's a very good question, and I think that's something you will be addressing over the next few weeks in the symposiums and seminars. There's a very interesting question on the role of religion in maintaining environmental sustainability. Yes, ethical conduct with other living beings can be a very positive and significant force. But my submission to any such question is that we need to look at it in context. So my university is in Haryana. Haryana has small communities of Bishnois. Bishnois also are there in large parts of Rajasthan. And the Bishnois from the 18th century, because of their 29 principles, do not fell green trees. And Bishnoi villages still have large numbers of blackbuck and chinkara because it's part of their ethic not to kill these animals, not to hunt them. And over the centuries, the animals know they are safe when they are within these Bishnoi areas. One of the top Hollywood film stars, Mr. Salman Khan, spent many months in jail because some Bishnois had seen him shooting blackbuck and chinkara, and they very bravely went up and gave evidence, which is very difficult to give against someone with such powerful commercial backing. He was with 3-4 others. He was not alone. I can't recall the names of the other stars. But one should also keep in mind that religious belief can also work the other way. Think, for example, of the fact that in much of India, the priests, the upper caste priests sat on the skin of the black antelope, the black buck. Today, the black buck is very rare. And some of the tantrics used the tiger skin. Tiger is even rarer. So in these cases, if you are to conform with the traditions of that religion today and use the black buck skin and tiger skin, you may contribute to the extinction of the black buck and the tiger. And I'm sure you are aware, and I don't know if you know this, that some species of sand boas are being hunted because some rich people have been told you for Vastu, if you kill the sand boa and bury it near the door, then you will make a lot of money in the stock market or whatever. Now, this is somebody hoodwinking them. But sand boas are being killed for this. Many species of horned owls in North India are rare because they are used for all sorts of rituals. So one should be very careful. Religion, just like secular ideology, can play a positive role. But given a certain context, it may not be such a positive role also. So I think there's no one answer. If you're looking for one answer and someone tells you they have it, please don't believe them. There's a very interesting question on Atmanirbhar Bharat. My answer is this announcement has just been made and one would like to wait, and in fullness of time, we'll have to wait what it means. Then we'll know. But my hope is and sense is Atmanirbhar should mean an India where the water is clean and potable and not contaminated, where the air is clean and not contaminated, where there are green spaces, and where the various forms of life which also make up Bharat also survive. Bharat is not only about Mera Bharat Mahan and 22 national languages and the various forms of dance and dress. It's also about all those species of butterflies and gnats and birds and fish and reptiles. So there can be a larger sense of the tapestry of life being a part of what constitutes a culture. And I hope that that diversity will be part of Atmanirbhar. Atmanirbhar becomes only, if it means more highways through very rare, very valuable forest areas which are not replaceable without planning them properly, then I think it would not be a good idea. So we have to be positive, and let's hope that these ideas result in constructive engagements with the environment. Yeah, we can take a couple of more questions.
So there's another question from Neha Kaushik. Sir, when we talk about sustainability, how do we explain this concept? I think this question moved away. How do we explain this concept to a group of people who cannot afford to practice it if they're hardly making the ends meet?
Yes, we don't. So, nobody is interested in us preaching to them. If you go and preach to them, they'll beat you up. Very simple. I'm very serious. Go and tell people who are dependent on a certain practice for basic living. Tell them don't do it. First, they'll listen to you. Then they'll say, what do we do in this place? If you say you don't know, they'll tell you, please go away. And one answer, of course, you can use a lot of government machinery and prevent them. They'll go and do it somewhere else, or they'll be worse off than they were. So I think this is a very good question. The Gir forest has recently reported a lot of lions, and lion numbers are up. And in the Gir forest in 1970s, they moved a lot of the Maldaris from a 250 square kilometer area in the Gir forest out. And that area has had a lot of recovery of cheetal and nilgai, and a lot of research has been done to show that the lions in the national park have stopped eating cattle. They don't trouble people. They're doing what lions ideally probably should do, which is to chase the deer and antelope. Everything's fine. But Dr. John Singh, who is a big scholar of the lions, has done a lot of very interesting work. He went to the Maldari villages and he found they are much worse off. Their occupation depended on raising buffaloes. The areas they've been put in, there's not good buffalo grazing. So the quality of the milk they produce is not as good. Their incomes have actually gone down. So I completely agree with you. I don't think this is about preaching to other people. It's about working out a better way. Can one work out a better way of life for the Maldari as well as for the lions? It's not possible in the same place if it's a different place. Who will bear the price and pay the cost? I especially like this question. I want to emphasize that far too often, groups who are underprivileged get the tag of being environmental destroyers, where far more privileged and better off groups are not paying the costs. We like to blame the United States and Germany, but this is true within societies. It's true within India, or for that matter, within China. So it's a very good question. And I do think that thinking about the environment, protecting the environment, improving the environment, conserving the environment, integrally has to have the sense of material and human dignity, particularly for the underprivileged. And that's one of the very important insights of environmental movements in many parts of India. So thank you, Neha. That's a very, very good question. I hope you go back and look at it. I want to suggest one very interesting paper. There's a lovely paper by Sabyasachi called The Tiger and the Honeybee. And I hope you read it. It looks at this dilemma in a tiger reserve. Now, one last question. Okay, can I go to the last question? Can we say we need to focus on availability before quality? I don't know if there is one answer to that. I'm sure within the participants of this workshop, you'll get 1, 2, 3, 4 answers. My submission is that the issue of nature or the environment is a test of democracy. Democracy is not about majority and minority. Democracy is also about coming to an understanding of issues based on debate, which are founded on reason. So what do we mean by quality? Whose quality do we mean? What do we mean by availability? The Elephant Task Force, it's up on the web. Please find it. Gaja, Securing a Future for Elephants in India. It's on the web. It's 187 pages. It's got a 1-page summary at the beginning, got a 3-page summary at the beginning. So you're welcome to look at it. Any questions, please email me. I can continue this later. Of course, conflicts are on the rise. Conflicts will be on the rise, and we need to ask why. And the answer to any question is, it should lead to more questions. Why? And the best way to counter the question why is to go on asking why. Because unless we learn how to think, it's very important, and think in new ways, in more synthetic ways, in ways that crisscross these different disciplines, but also draw on the strengths of these disciplines, we won't get the hang of this problem. This is a complex issue. It's also a difficult issue, but it's not so complex that we can't think about it. And I'm very encouraged by the questions. I want to thank every single person who's asked a question. I also want to thank those people who got even more questions, which they can't ask because there's no time.
Thank you, sir, for answering those questions in such detailed manner. If, with your permission, if I may, I have a small query of my own, if I can ask.
Please go ahead.
So it's sort of a new age problem. Basically, it's a problem. It troubles me, and I'm sure that all environmentally conscious souls who are, it would trouble them as well. So with all the environmental activism we see arising in recent times, and some of the government, and side by side some of the government policies, like the denotification of protected areas that we have seen in Assam, Dehing Patkai, and the areas near the Digboi, Assam oil fields. So, and again, the revision of AIA. Now, these decisions are almost ignoring all public voices coming from all sides. So, I just wish to, have a general query from you: how to be heard, how we can be heard, so that these decisions also interpret public choices and public voices.
I think we need to enrich public debate. There's no answer. Keep engaging in new ways, find new ways, and keep engaging, and try to emphasize that these are not about that particular tiger reserve or those elephants or those waters. They affect the quality of life, the larger well-being of a much larger number of people, both present and future. And that even existing frameworks, codes, rules, flawed as they are being flouted. We need better traffic rules, but we start by enforcing the rules that are there. They're not being enforced. So one is that. And they're particularly not being enforced with very big players. In fact, the bigger the player, the less the enforcement. And the other, of course, is to engage further in the public on a different way of thinking. A very famous quote of Einstein. It's very awful to take refuge behind a quotation, but I will. He said, we cannot solve our problems with the old way of thinking. It's the old way of thinking which contributed to the problem in the first place. So we need a new way of thinking. So, there is a famous saying, Zara sochiye. Sochiye, lekin naye sire se sochiye. Naye dhang se sochiye. Boliye, lekin naye dhang se boliye. Naye dhang se bolna or sochna. So the newer way of thinking and, being, and this larger sense of awareness. It's not an easy task, but it's a very important beginning, because the sense today in different parts of the world, particularly in countries like India, is that the environment today is vital, because the environment we're in is not livable. It's not habitable. It is not secure. It is not safe. It is not sustainable. It's not secure. I'm not referring to threat to your life. I'm referring to indirect things, the contamination of water, of air, of the breakdown of the systems that sustain a habitable environment. Those systems have to be kept. And there is much more awareness than we reckon with. And these are shortcut, linear development solutions. We need development, but we need a different way of thinking about development. So not come out as anti-development, argue for a different kind of development. So as I said, the material dignity with the ecological integrity. How do we keep these? That's a tough balance to strike. And I think that's why a symposium like yours is especially welcome. I was looking at your list. You have some very fine practitioners, scholars, thinkers, and you should pose these questions to them and then debate it amongst yourselves. So I wish I could be there for all the sessions, but that may be a little. I'll be present in the spirit, even if I'm not there in the flesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for giving those thoughts of yours. सो आई एम श्योर इसके बाद हम बिल्कुल नए कुछ लोग हम में से डेफिनेटली नए तरीके से सोचेंगे और नए तरीके से एक्ट भी करेंगे. So some audience may know that Professor Rangarajan has been slightly unwell in the past few days, and so we do owe him a special thanks for delivering his lecture here today, giving us so much of his valuable time. So we all really appreciate that, sir. And now I would invite Dr. Neha Mishra for delivering a brief vote of thanks and conclude today's session.
Thank you, Dr. Naveen. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Department of Environmental Studies, Indraprastha College for Women, I would like to extend my gratitude to all of you present here today with us for this inaugural session of the online certificate program on environment, ecology, environment, and sustainability. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Mahesh Rangarajan for such an engrossing and enlightening presentation today. So you have beautifully highlighted all the major historical events which have shaped our present environment and how environmental awareness and opting environmental protection can help us shape a better future for us. Thank you so much, sir. I would also like to extend our gratitude to our principal, Professor Babli Moitra Saraf, for her constant support and guidance in organizing the course. Thank you, ma'am, for your words of encouragement today. Now, I would like to express my gratitude to Coordinator, Center for Art Studies, Dr. Anandita Roy Saha, for conceptualizing the course and for her constant support in organizing it. I would also like to thank all the faculty members present here today with us. And last but not the least, all the participants from all across India. Thank you so much to all of you. Here, I would like to inform you all, the course is going to begin from tomorrow. And we again request you to keep a tab on the course website for all the updates related to the upcoming lectures. Thank you so much. So I think we are done here. So thank you so much for all your presence. And we hope to see all the participants tomorrow with us with the start of this course. Thank you so much.
The participants may leave now.
Yeah, the participants, yes. So see you all tomorrow.
And please do remember to join tomorrow by 2:15, and that's where we are going to start our tomorrow's session.
So please be there tomorrow on time. Thank you so much, everyone.